Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where we will be discussing effective resource management in your PMO strategy. My name is Doug Welsby, and I'm the channel manager here at Wickersoft. I'm also joined by Richard Evans, leader of our advisory practice, and Scott Daly, a senior account executive here at Wickersoft. During today's webinar, attendees will be on mute and the line will not be open for questions. However, please feel free to use the GoToWebinar chat feature to submit questions. I will address these questions during the webinar and will respond via email if we do not get to your specific question. And if for some reason you get distracted or pulled away during the webinar, no need to worry, as I will be emailing a link to the presentation once it has been posted to our YouTube channel. I'll now turn the presentation over to Richard, who will be handling the webinar.
Thanks, Doug. Hello, everyone. This is Richard. Today I'm covering a resource strategy, really a checklist for a comprehensive resource management strategy. It's tailored towards a project organization, although a lot of it is relevant for any big department that's managing many resources. So what I have for you is a 5-step checklist, really. Now, in these 5 steps, probably the most important or technically challenging one is the one in the middle, step 3, which is about managing supply and demand, and that's the technical and data challenge and process challenge of how you actually plan and assign resources to work and move them from one thing to another. Now, when we talk about a resource strategy for PMOs, we often are very focused on that, and rightly so, and we're going to look at that today. And in fact, because that's a factor that's enabled by technology and data, Scott from our solutions team is going to help me by giving you a quick glimpse of what that can look like. So that's often the focus, and then separately we often focus on the skills planning side, the vendor management side, the culture side, and we often treat those things separately. But what I'm suggesting is let's connect all of those things together because they are all related. So we're going to start off by looking at step 1, which is planning for the skills needs for the future based on what the business strategy is. What skills do we need for the future? Second, being deliberate about how much time we should spend on projects versus time spent on keeping the lights on. Thirdly, we'll take a dive into that area of how do we balance top-down and bottom-up planning and optimize resource capacity and assignments. Fourth, we'll look at when and how we should use staffing and outside support, contract support. And if we're not, what are we doing to build skills internally? And then finally, touch on community of practice. So what kind of culture and behaviors do we want to see from people, and how will we reinforce that? And you've seen in this model, I've drawn this blue line at the bottom. What's so important, I think, is to have metrics for all of these things. Some of these things can be measured with very objective and crisp measures. Others will require a bit of creativity and soft measures. Fundamentally, we should have metrics for all of these things. Now, what's driving today a need for a focus on resource management strategy in the project management world is a lot of these things that come from a report we did at Wickersoft recently around project management trends of the future, which we're seeing as very real this year. So these are some of the business drivers for resource management. One is the consolidation of PMOs, how we're moving often from having isolated PMOs to a more of an enterprise federated model. That's because the lines between technology and business are blurring with digital transformation, and There's a lot of cost efficiencies and communications and efficiencies that go with that consolidation. Second thing is the simplification of project management. So think about Agile, the move away from very rigorous, detailed methodologies, more to velocity of project management. Thirdly, in the technology space, the growth of work management tools. Fourth, scaling Agile. So I mentioned Agile before. What we're seeing is everybody largely today is doing, to some extent, some Agile or a lot of Agile in their organization. So the next step is to actually scale that to an enterprise approach. And when that happens, it has implications for things like strategic planning, budgeting, and how you do your resource management on a big scale. Another thing is skills change. So from a resource perspective, we're seeing a shift from hard or technical skills in the project management world to a need for softer skills. We'll talk about that as well. And finally, program management, the subject of program management, those big transformation initiatives, because that as a discipline is evolving in line with Agile practices and change management practices, that also has a bearing on this too. Now, step one, I'm talking here about looking at the skills for the future and having a plan for skills for the future that aligns with the business strategy. I've pulled up here some research from Gartner that I saw the other day, which I think is very interesting. So what this bit of research by Gartner is saying is that when they surveyed people doing digital transformation across a number of organizations, and talk to those leaders and people involved in digital transformation, what they found was that the people they were actually collaborating with, at the bottom of the list, were program and portfolio management. However, when asked, who do you think you should be collaborating with for digital transformation, program and portfolio management was at the top of the list. So there's this big gap and disparity there. And to some extent, that's a call to action and slightly alarming. But at the same time, it's a great opportunity, and it's one that can be addressed with resource management and thinking about skills. So on this step one of looking at the long-term skills needs, and putting together a plan for what that might be, I would say top of mind right now would be the following. Customer and industry knowledge, paramount. Technology, of course. Mindset, too. So if you think about, again, simplification of PM, the growth of Agile. Agile is effectively a mindset, as is business transformation skills. So going back to that bit of research from Gartner, the people who can fill that gap between digital transformation and project management, the people who will fill that gap are those who can sort of be a bit creative, be a bit proactive, and go out to the business and say, hey, it looks like you're doing some transformation here. Can I help you with that? And people who can be creative about adjusting methodologies in order to work for that business objective and make some trade-offs on methodology in order to get things done. I think a great part of a skills plan, or rather a great characteristic of someone in the project management world today would be understanding the potential of technology. Don't have to be an expert in everything. I think what's most valuable is to say, oh yeah, if you're trying to solve that problem, maybe artificial intelligence would help, or maybe for this, we could think about having a bot. Just understanding the application of technology. And of course, leadership. If we're putting together a plan for the future, we should be thinking about the qualities and the characteristics of our future leaders. And so we should be planning at an early stage for what we want those behaviors and people to look like. Okay, second here is how much time should we invest in projects? So in projects versus keep the lights on. Now, I've seen a lot of different ratios here. I would say that 80-20 is pretty common, 80 operations and 20 keep the lights on. But again, this varies hugely depending on whether you're in IT or in a business unit or something else. It also varies by person and by team, and that's absolutely fine. What I think is important is, although you can be very flexible and creative about this, is just to have some deliberate goals about this. I'll give you an example. I was working a while ago helping an organization where we had a large business unit trying to drive technology projects from an IT organization of several hundred. There's a huge backlog of work going back 2 years. So everyone was frustrated because projects weren't getting done and there were so many things behind. And when we dug deeper, the assumption was, well, maybe the technology people aren't working fast enough, or maybe we don't have enough of them. What was interesting is the business thought that the technology folks were spending 90% of their time on projects, and nobody actually knew. So we did an exercise to a bit of time sheeting, bit of assessment, and found out that in fact they were spending 10% of their time on projects and 90% on everything else, and 90% was on fixing things that had issues. So that was a real wake-up call, but also very helpful because it enabled people with real data to understand what the reality was, and therefore set in place a strategy for turning that around. So that's the fundamental point: is be deliberate about this, whether it's by individual or by team. And now I'm a big fan of scaling Agile using SAFe. If that's what you're into, SAFe is the way of one of the ways of scaling Agile to the enterprise level. DevOps is part of that wave. There's some thinking that if you're doing those approaches, this becomes less important because with those methods, you are creating value streams and aligning people to value streams. Those value streams are the processes, the systems that are really critical in the organization, drive value. And so you create resource stability by assigning people to those things long term, and then they flex between fixing things and helping customers as well as innovation and new projects. However, I would still argue that you should have a deliberate strategy in those circumstances for this, because the tendency in reality is always that as time goes by, people get drawn more into operational things, and the innovation work suffers if nobody's really monitoring that. All right, number 3, managing supply and demand. So this, like I said, is a data-rich and process-rich challenge to get right. So here I'm talking about, again, thinking about project organizations, especially how you do resource capacity planning and estimating, how you assign resources by name to work. Data visualization is the name of the game here. It also implies having one place for resource data, even if that's not achievable immediately or even ever. There's ways to sort of connect things to at least get insight into all resource data. It also implies doing a good job around categorizing everyone in terms of their role and their skill. And this tends to happen from time to time in organizations. It needs a refresh quite often because this stuff can get sort of out of date. Again, think back to the step 1 I was talking about of skills planning. And there's some degree of maturity involved in here. You can't achieve all of this overnight. The business driver behind all of this, in my mind, is really all about velocity. That if you get this right, you're able to increase the throughput of your project work. You're able to move people from one thing to the next without there being big interruptions, bottlenecks. It's all about velocity of delivery in my mind. Of course, there's cost efficiency attached to all of that as well. It's all about getting things to market, getting things to customers quickly. My second point on this is how important it is that your approach is dynamic. And by that, I mean, you can spend time designing the process for this and getting it right, but don't expect everything to fall into place after that. There needs to be an agile approach to this where you have to keep trying things, adjusting, walk back from some of your original design intentions. It does require a lot of creative flexibility to keep constantly evolving and fine-tuning this. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple of examples of solutions here. I talked before about the idea of maturity for this and having a plan for how you mature into getting good at managing supply and demand. And one of the first steps is often looking at resource budgeting and think about, maybe your quarterly or annual budgeting cycle at the high level. And I'm going to just hand over to my colleague Scott here, who's just going to show a couple of things on that topic.
All right, Richard, thank you. I hope, first of all, that Richard has conveyed a sense that there's a lot of work and consideration that has to go into implementing anything like what I'm about to show that has nothing to do with the tool or the technology. The nice thing is that there are a lot of places to facilitate your goals and your objectives that the tool makes easier and frankly makes come together in a way that wasn't possible 20 years ago. At the same time, there's a lot of functionality in what you're about to see that I'm just going to quickly gloss over. This isn't intended to be an in-depth demo of what the tool can do, but I do want to make sure that we show that a lot of what Richard says can be implemented in practical terms in any organization. So what you're looking at this point is an example of the social networking integration project. It, of course, could be any project you want at all. And what we've done at a very high level is lay down some resource demand for this particular project by role and by name as well, but by time. So in this case, we've set a budget for Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. There are a few things that I want to call your attention to about the product. If I wanted to change this from hours to percent to FTE, I could. If I wanted to talk about budget, forecast, actuals, revenue, things like that. If I wanted to reset the date range, I could do that, filter, et cetera, make public and keep it pre-published. Those are the kinds of things that I could do that we're not going to talk about at all for the purposes of this demo. More importantly, what I want to call your attention to is that this level of planning exists before you might create a work breakdown structure or a WBS. So this isn't hinged on any kind of deep project kind of scheduling or planning or anything complicated. This is probably the way a lot of people think about kind of doing planning. And the other thing is that all of this can be done, you have a project as a bucket for planned work, but if you were to say, look, we want to have a product here, and then we wanted to look at all of that information kind of across multiple projects, we'll be able to do that. Now, I'll get to that in a second. So the key point here being resource planning occurring according to resource capacity and according to role. In this case, it could be according to skills over time without requiring a project schedule. That piece, let me see if I can pull that in. That piece, just the resource piece, can be imported into what we call the financial plan. And the financial plan is more than just the resource piece. In this case, you can see we have the business analyst, developer, and tester, and things like that. But these are cost categories. So we have a labor cost category, We have a materials and supply cost category. We have a travel expense cost category, software, etc. These are completely configurable. But in your own organization, again, you probably have an annual planning cycle or annual budgeting or a capital planning cycle where you're asked to make decisions about what you're likely to spend on various pieces over the next year. We actually have clients that work in time frames of up to 20 and 40 years, and of course their planning does tend to look a little bit differently in those time scales, but we can still accommodate that level of flexibility. But the short of it is that you're able to, at the top level, go through and say, we can level these analysts, or we can say that we have this demand for these roles, and we're able to kind of include these other categories as well. And so once you've gone through that process, the next question becomes very obvious is, okay, I need to look at the results of that process, and maybe I want to say, what do I need to do in terms of resources and in terms of budget to see what I'm doing across the company. So in this case, we've set this up with a specific portfolio of projects. Again, that would be completely configurable. You're able to kind of look at both proposed projects and active projects, estimated start, end dates, a Gantt chart across the bottom, but more to the kind of interest in the point of, I think, Richard's presentation, you're able to see the totals from across all the possible projects that you could be working on. And of course, if you want to take projects out, or if you want to look at this in terms of resource demand, you're able to see, okay, if we do these projects, including this proposed project, these named resources, in this case, they're set up by team, have these bottlenecks. So you might want to drill in and see, okay, where's the excess demand for team one, for example, supporting customers using mobile. And if I wanted to come in and I wanted to, let's see if this one is going to be the right one to take out. Hopefully it will be. No. So anyway, the point being, if we wanted to model this by taking out the right project, we could then see ourselves kind of relieving these bottlenecks. We're also able to delay the start of projects if that's what you wanted to do as well. And again, in this case, you can see we've got a lot of controls across the top: quarterly, plan type. How do we want to look at this? Do we want to look at this via pivot chart? Do we want to look at this via financial plans instead of resources? Do we want to save scenarios? Do we want to actually, do multiple scenarios where we look at various ways that we could leverage our resources, and then do a comparison later on, or ultimately publish them out as the final scenario that we want to go with, for example, for the next quarter or the next year? The short of it being that once you've kind of gone through the steps that Richard was outlining to arrive at a team and a set of skills, and you're able to match this up against the practicalities of demand, and this would include demand from across Agile projects, non-project work, and project work as well, all without ever actually having to do a detailed project schedule, which of course you can compare to these various levels of planning as well, but for the purposes of this particular demo and Richard's conversation, I wanted to keep it at a high level. So with that, Richard, if you would like to take it back and continue your presentation, I will make you the presenter again.
That's great. Thanks, Scott. I think that's a really great example of how you can create visualization in this space. That's actually, so I mentioned before, Scott's from our solutions team, and that's something Scott's team built on the Microsoft platform for this purpose. So yeah, continuing this thread then. So going back to the idea of maturity. So what I see people often grappling with is this idea of, should I be doing my resource planning top down only, or do I need to do it bottom up as well? And wow, there really isn't one answer to that. I think top down planning is where people naturally start and may even end. Mastering top down planning can be effective in itself, and that's fine, especially in a in a fast-moving environment. If you can balance that with bottom-up planning at the same time, you're going to get a lot more data, a lot more learning to help you get even better in the future. More data on cost, more detail on individuals. Overall, I think that the objective should be to have a resource management maturity plan. So that would have many elements to it. Everyone should have their own version of that maturity plan. But to go back to what Scott was showing, step one might be to get really great at resource budgeting, that sort of annual or quarterly planning cycle where you're doing things at a very high level, but you still would benefit from being able to see, as Scott was showing, those visualizations of availability, capacity versus supply versus demand, reds and greens, what is possible, and then from there perhaps evolve to capacity planning, and then from there move to resource tracking. That step may not even be achievable or even make business sense for a lot of people because of the detail involved. But that is a very beneficial step, because if you're actually tracking what people are actually doing, what time things actually took, what the costs actually were, again, it's going to really make your estimations so much more accurate in the future. Don't have to achieve that overnight. So I want to go back and ask my good friend Scott here to show something else around capacity planning. So we won't get into the weeds of resource tracking today. There's so many things we could show you, but Scott just showed you resource budgeting, what that looks like in a good solution. So let's look at capacity planning. I'll just hand over to you again, Scott. So you have the ball.
All right, thank you, Richard. What we see in a lot of organizations, and this dovetails with kind of how Richard has structured this, is really three levels, and not necessarily three levels of planning, and there are not necessarily clear, bright lines between each level, but they all exist in most organizations, and they are where people kind of struggle with this is they're all legitimate. And people say, well, how can you have three kinds of planning in an organization that are all legitimate? And it's probably a discussion for a different day, but if you reflect for a moment on the fact that, yes, every year people are asked to put together an annual plan, and yes, every year people are asked to build project schedules based on a work breakdown structure, and those projects typically run across multiple years and take into account some very low-level considerations that weren't available when the annual plans were being made. You realize that certainly both of those two types of planning, are both 100% legitimate and exist and need to be reconciled. But a third kind that you see in a lot of organizations, and that's always been present and is becoming much more so as we start to recognize the fact that people are involved in projects that are being run with an agile methodology, or that people are, to Richard's point, not working on anywhere near as much project time as business sponsors may assume they are, and that is just a resource-centric based view of the world. So a resource manager or a line manager or a capacity planner doesn't tend to think of the world in terms of capital budgets or in terms of projects, but what they do is they think of the world in terms of I own a set of resources, and I have incoming demand for those people, and I need to plan what they're going to do in a way that ensures, of course, that they're going to get done what they're supposed to, but more to the point that they're not overbooked. In this case, Amy is overbooked in the month of June, or that they're not completely underbooked, for example, where Kono has nothing at all going on. And so this very kind of straightforward process oftentimes occurs informally and consequently can't be aggregated or properly compared to project schedules and the capital budgeting cycle. But in this case, by providing a facility that is very Excel-like, very kind of basically a spreadsheet that allows you to take a look at just your list of resources, filter them and sort them in whatever way you want to. And we won't go into kind of the features across the top in terms of this and turn this into a tool demonstration. But you're able to say, look, I want to take a look at what is being asked for from a developer standpoint. And you can see over here we have an indicator that shows that this is in a proposed state. You are able to do things like making notes, deleting the whole plan, allocating people. But I'm able to kind of say, okay, I have some demand for social networking that's being signaled for a developer at 5 hours. If I wanted to take this and move this up to a particular person, this has been locked for some reason, but I'm able to drag and drop these. I'm also able to, in the case of Amy, if I just wanted to come in and say I wanted to relieve this on her, I would be able to just zero this out and see her go to green. There is also a workflow if you choose to implement it that will route you through, again, a proposed state, a draft state, a committed state that can go back and forth between the project managers and the resource capacity planners. That's all kind of more about a tool for a tool demo if anybody's interested in that. The main thrust of this should be, however, that if you're in an environment where you're having a lot of conflicts between the project managers and the resource managers and you can't quite figure out why, a lot of times it is because there's this completely legitimate third way to be planning what a resource is doing that's resource-centric and focused on making sure that people are being utilized and not overutilized, that plugs right into the rest of the capital planning cycle and the project planning cycle. And with that, Richard, if you would like to take it back and close us up.
Excellent. Thanks, Scott. That's a great overview. Thank you. All right, so number 4, when to get help from the outside, when to focus on the inside. So here we're talking about staffing, vendors, contracting, and I think my bottom line on this is a bit like some of my other points, which is be deliberate about this. Now, I'll tell you a couple of stories from recent experience. So number 1, I should point out, by the way, Microsoft, we also do staffing and managed delivery. And what we found is that some of our customers have found that the CapEx, OpEx advantage of outsourcing is in their favor. So if you're a publicly traded company, it's often gives you competitive advantage to reduce your CapEx. So that's obviously one reason. There are other nuances in that space that I personally don't fully understand as well around CapEx and OpEx. But to me, it's all about the pros and cons of agility, cost, and productivity. And one story I'll tell you, we had an organization we work with in the telecom space. We do a lot of work in the telecom space. And a while ago, for various reasons, they said, hey, can you help us with some engineering work and labor? In the telecom space, you have to provision or set up networks for businesses all the time, hundreds, thousands a week. Setting up new networks of people, and you can do this work on a PC. It's today programmers, IT folks can provision networks for customers and businesses, but it's a very skilled and it's very it's the kind of thing you don't want to get wrong. And anyway, so as an experiment, we started creating a team to do this to help our customer, and it turned into a long-term managed delivery scenario. It started off as a short-term thing, turned into a long-term thing, and here's why. What we found was the customer was taking metrics on our performance and on what was happening internally, and we found that by having this team that was external, what we did was play to the gig economy and other things that are part of modern outsourcing, where we incentivized all of our team financially by the amount of business deliverables they were able to produce. They were also part of the gig economy and able to work from home. What happened when we looked at the metrics was the defects from the process went down, the cost and the customer went down, and yet the people doing the work were being paid more. So literally everybody wins in this scenario. But that's how the gig economy is shaping up, and some have managed delivery. Now, conversely, we have customers who say the opposite, who say, no, our trend, our strategy right now is to increase the percentage of internal skills and staff and rely less on outside. And so in that scenario, what is important to have, and often have these conversations too, is a plan for how you're going to keep those people's skills current and so on. So if you think about project managers, what are you doing around certifying them in Scrum or whatever it is, or training them regularly, teaching them new technology, giving them a career path? And that's very important, especially if you have a strategy that, like I said, is increasingly trying to convert your vendors to internal employees. Fifth and finally, community of practice. To me, culture at work is a mathematical equation which equals the values, the things we say, write down, that we claim to believe in, multiplied by behavior, what people actually do when nobody's looking. And let's go back to, project organization. If we are going back to our skills planning, if we believe in a certain mindset, a certain methodology, a certain set of business transformation attributes in our people, if we believe in staying current on technology as a project management community so we can advise people on what they should consider, then we need to be creating a community that's all about helping each other out on methods, coaching each other, learning, and building those hard skills and those soft skills. So finally, just to wrap all that up then, 5 steps. You may not have control over all of these, but you can certainly influence these, and I'd urge you to do so, because they are all somehow tied to project performance and project metrics. And my key point really is to have data on all of these things. So even if you as a project organization, as a PMO, are not fully in control of these, you can still help out by creating metrics and data for everything. And by that, I mean measuring delivery performance, about measuring the business results and outcomes of things, but also measuring team health. Very important. All right, that is me for today. I want to thank Doug. I want to thank Scott from our solutions team for showing us what solutions look like for that gnarly area of resource supply and demand. I'm from our advisory practice. We help customers with redesigning PMOs, going agile, resource management strategy, how to manage really big complex initiatives, and so on. So please feel free to drop me a line. We'll also be sharing the output and the documentation from this webinar with you all later. Thank you.